I really enjoy watching our kids grow up. And we can mean so many different things with that phrase, grow up. It's true, it is really exciting to watch your kids get bigger and bigger, to watch them become adults. And, the thing that I really get excited about, though, is seeing my kids and really anyone to mature, to move away from a self-centered reality and to start living outside of themselves. And I see that in my kids when they take the money that they've worked hard for and they go and they buy a present for someone else, or they listen to their mother or to me. They do their chores, not because they have to, but because they love us. And I see that when my kids ask questions too. Sometimes I'm not even sure how to answer them. Just this last week, my 4-year-old, we're talking about my 4-year-old. She comes up to me and she says, "Daddy, why can't I see God? But in my dreams, I see Jesus." So as a pastor, one of the things that I really struggle with communicating is that God is 3 distinct persons, and yet he's one God. And here's my 4-year-old trying to understand more of who God is. And in the process, she expresses so perfectly the oneness of God and the mystery of the Trinity. I have to wonder, what is she going to be like when she grows up? What sort of adult are my kids going to grow up to be? And how will these events shape them? We think about it the opposite way all the time. We see an adult who's particularly successful or what have you, and we wonder what happened in their childhood. How are they prepared for the day that they're living today, to be who they are? We can think about the same thing as we think about who we are. There are certain memories that we carry forward with us, moments in time that have shaped us. And so as we get to know Daniel again today, we're going to be taking a step back first. I want to understand as much as we can about the environment that Daniel grew up in. See, Daniel, he grew up in the kingdom of Judah. We talked about that last week. When Daniel was born, the king was named Josiah. And Josiah reigned in Judah until he was 39 years old. And he started quite young. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, we learn that it was the 8th year of Josiah's reign when he began to seek after God. It was the 12th year when he finally began to purge from Judah and Jerusalem the idols and the pagan practices that were taking root in the land. Josiah was convicted too about the terrible condition of Solomon's temple, and he went to have it refurbished and rebuilt. And while they were rebuilding the temple, they found a book, the book of the law. Imagine losing God's instructions in the place where everyone was supposed to be gathering to worship him. How often, though, is God's word, his truth, absent from churches even today, here in Canada? In 2 Kings 23, verses 1 through 3, we read, "Then the king sent, and all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem were gathered to him. And the king went up to the house of the Lord. And with him all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets, all of the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant that were written in this book." And all the people joined in the covenant. So Daniel, and if we do some math here, probably Daniel's parents grew up in the midst of this revival. If you remember, Daniel is actually a part of the royal family, in the court and probably around Josiah quite a bit while he's growing up. His parents would have as well. So during this time, Josiah led many people back to a godly lifestyle, but for a lot of them, it was just a change in behavior. Others, though, it was a reawakening. And Daniel was just a boy when Josiah died. So I have to wonder, what impact did God's word have on Daniel's parents? Or was it maybe his grandparents who taught Daniel not just how to act like God asked him to act, but to truly love God, to live in relationship with God, to trust him? And the revival was a tremendous success for God's people, for establishing a remnant in Judah of people who truly sought to follow God and everything that he taught. Daniel was one of these people. On the other front, though, it was an absolute failure, and part of that was inside of Josiah's own family. We're told that both of his sons and his grandson and even a brother who followed him as kings and puppet kings over Judah, they did evil in the sight of the Lord. They weren't good leaders. It started with Jehoiakim, who put his faith in foreign kings instead of trusting in God. It just gives us some insight into who Daniel was, the environment he'd seen, not only the power that God's word has to transform individuals and even to transform a nation, but Daniel's seen how quickly independence from God can destroy us. We're talking about just a handful of years. And this is how Daniel chooses to introduce himself to us. Go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 8. We get our first real look at who Daniel is in a demonstration of Daniel's faith in God. Even as a young man, Daniel knows both that God is in control and that God is worth trusting. He's worth having faith in. Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 21 reads, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, 'I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king.' Well, then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 'Test your servants. For 10 days let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see.' So he listened to them in this manner, and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." So first off, and I hinted at this earlier, but what is our basic obstacle to having faith in God? Well, really, it's independence from God. That's likely going to be the biggest obstacle that I think any of us are going to face. Independence from God can be expressed in different ways, though. It can be expressed in our own selfishness, our own self-centeredness. We're independent from everything, or so we think. Or it can also be expressed through dependence on the wrong things. We're supposed to depend on God, but we can depend on so many other things. And this story gives us a very tangible example right here. The king's table is something that Daniel could have depended on. I mean, Daniel's probably was used to eating good food at one point in Judah, but recently he'd been eating whatever happened to be available. Judah had been under siege. And now he's being offered the best food in the largest empire of the known world. But as we talked about last week, Daniel knows that God ultimately is in control, even in this situation. And so he isn't just following God out of a sense of duty or learned behavior. He's had plenty of opportunities, along with most of his nation, to put away those sorts of ideas. Daniel's life, his identity, depends on God. And so he's able to live with great obedience because he has faith in God, because he has a relationship with God. So even when the world is wrong and it's set against Daniel's able to live in a state of peace. And I think another thing that we have to learn here to take away from Daniel is to know, how do we handle conflicts that come up because we're following God, because we're following Jesus? Or another way to phrased that question, how do I obey God when he's asked me to live under the authority of ungodly people? So we have this basic formula. I mean, we know God is in control. We know that God is trustworthy. So we can have faith in God. And that faith in God allows us to live at peace. We've seen this specifically in Daniel's actions of faith right here. And there's a lot of things that are putting pressure on Daniel to live differently, to not depend on God. He's been given a new name. He's being taught the language and even the literature and the values of a culture that is set against God. He's living in a palace that's likely decorated with images and stories of these imaginary offensive deities. But Daniel doesn't say anything about those. There's also an implication here that some time has passed since Daniel has entered the king's household. The chief of the eunuchs has actually taken a liking and perhaps even respects Daniel and his friends. What happened up to this point? I mean, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they've been living in the king's palace. Maybe it's been days, maybe it's been weeks, we're not told. It's possible that they were actually eating the king's food. Maybe you found yourself in that situation where all of a sudden you're convicted that something you're doing is wrong and you have to take action. But Daniel doesn't say that he wasn't going to defile himself any longer. He just says that he would not defile himself with the king's food. I think Daniel's found some way to avoid coming into conflict up to this point. My kids, they're really good at finding ways to avoid eating their vegetables. Maybe Daniel's been doing exactly the opposite. But it can't go on forever. And Daniel knows that. He knows that he can't eat this food without compromising his values, because it goes directly against God's law. But he also knows that he can get in trouble if he refuses to eat the king's food. Your parents probably taught you, when you're a guest, you need to make sure to try everything you're given. Anything else is just rude. And being rude to an absolute dictator, an absolute monarch who's known for cruelty and power, well, the consequences of that could be life-ending. Just asking for an exemption is actually a big risk. And so Daniel asks for this exemption, and the chief official here puts some more pressure on Daniel. I can't do that, he says. Now Daniel listens to him, though. And you'll notice that Daniel doesn't say that he'll eat the food after 10 days. He just says, deal with us accordingly. Now you see a lot of people who claim the name of Christ today, and they get confused. They think that because God is in control, that they're in control of every situation, or worse yet, they think that they have some control over God. Daniel doesn't make that mistake. He has uncanny wisdom for a teenager. He tells this man who's basically his boss and his jailer, who has authority over him, he talks to him and he submits to his authority. Daniel knows God, who is in control, has placed this man over him, just as God has given the kingdom of Judah over to Nebuchadnezzar, like we talked about last week. We don't have time today, but if you want some extra credit, some extra understanding, study Romans 13. You can get some additional information there on what it's like to follow God under an ungodly authority. But that ungodly authority doesn't give Daniel an excuse to be disobedient. It doesn't give him an excuse to stop depending on God. Because God is in control, we know that God is trustworthy, and we know that we can have faith in God. And that means that in the face of all types of obstacles, we can live at peace within ourselves, in all circumstances, yes, but also with others in many situations. Hebrews 12:14 says, strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which none of us will see the Lord. And that's exactly what Daniel is doing here. He doesn't compromise as he's seeking God's holiness. But instead, he seeks to navigate this conflict to maximize the peace that he has in his relationships with other people. And there's another reason that this is important for us as we live in relationship with God. Our key verse in 1 Peter 2:11 reminds us that our citizenship isn't of this world. We're foreigners. And that means that we're also ambassadors. We're representatives of God. Go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy 3:7. This is the idea that Paul's working with as he encourages Timothy to make sure to find elders who are well thought of by outsiders. so that they aren't going to fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Now, before we get to wrapping things up here, there's one more big idea, something that I really want to make sure that we take home from the example of Daniel. And that is, how do we pursue obedience? It's really important that we not pursue obedience to God as a behavior modification, as a duty or an obligation, as a law, but that we pursue righteousness and holiness. We pursue obedience as a relationship with God. 1 Corinthians 6:12 really makes this clear. Paul's talking to a group of people and they're saying, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. You see, some people, they really like to color inside the lines. We like to have rules in place so that we know what we can do, what we can't do. And in this way, a law can be really comforting. And up to the point of Jesus' death on the cross, God has essentially given his people a coloring book to help them understand righteousness and holiness. Now, a lot of Daniel's countrymen, they gave up on their coloring books, and in the process, they gave up on the righteousness and holiness. Daniel, though, he didn't just learn how to color inside the lines, but he was really paying attention and learned how to make something beautiful based on the truth that God taught him. And here in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul is dealing with people kind of like Daniel's countrymen who they've been coloring inside the lines their whole life, and they're so excited that now Paul is saying it's more than the law, so they've thrown away the coloring book and they're just throwing paint on the page any which way, and they're calling it art. And Paul says to them, you're missing the point. You see, they saw the law as a restriction on their rights. And now that the law was removed, they feel that they have the right to do anything. And Paul says that's not really true. You might say that everything is permissible, but God says that not everything is beneficial. Removing the law allows us to pursue righteousness and holiness the way God always intended it. We live out our relationship with God, and that is made possible because of our faith in God. We know that he's in control. We know that he is worthy of trust. And that changes who we are. In every situation, in every circumstance, our truth, though, doesn't change because we continue to depend on an unchanging God for our definitions, for our identity. Daniel became a man in the context of a cultural transition. He grew up as the two Hebrew kingdoms were waning. There was one last great revival in Daniel, and I believe his parents were caught up in that, and it taught them the truth of God's word, and that transformed their lives. But ultimately, the leadership and the people of Judah, by and large, they chose to follow their sinful nature, and it was the end of an age for God's people. We also live in a culture that's in transition. Perhaps we do have another great revival before the end of this age, but in both sides of the war for our culture, people are calling evil good. And they're calling good things evil. And our culture is divided about facts and obsessed with facts. And we're so focused on that we've lost sight of the importance of truth. You see, a fact can be proven or disproven. It can get complicated with lots of details. But truth, though, real truth has the power to transform who we are. The truth doesn't change because it's found in Jesus Christ. Right now, it might be hard to distinguish between the facts that are real and the facts that are fiction. In my undergrad, I took several classes on journalism, and one of the things that they drilled into us is that nobody is without bias, and we have to be aware of those biases so we can keep those biases in check. And our media has always struggled with bias. And today we have a whole new source of information that's so fed up with biased gatekeeping that they've done away with gatekeeping altogether. And so all of the information, all of the facts are available. Some of those facts are real, and a lot of them are fiction for one reason or another, sometimes even because people are trying to deceive us. But I have yet to see a fact, real or fiction, throughout history that has changed the truth. The truth that can truly transform us, that can truly set us free, that gives us real liberty. And that truth is that we were created to live in relationship with God and to follow His Word. And our ancestors failed to do that. And so God set aside a people for Himself. And He showed them righteousness in the law. And it was ultimately a law that they couldn't keep. The great mystery of the Old Testament is that even though the Jewish people could not meet God's standard of righteousness, they were saved. And Paul tells us that that mystery has been answered, and we know that they were saved because of their faith in God. And we see that faith lived out in Daniel's life even as a young man. He is able to live with righteousness, not because of his discipline or his own inherent goodness, but because of his faith in God, because he knows that God is in control and he knows that God is trustworthy. And so today I don't want to get up in front of you and debate facts or figures. I want you to know that when I speak, I'm all about the truth. And I'm sure of the truth. And we need more than anything right now in our country, we need truth. I don't have to guess, though, to understand the general trend. I'm not going to give you a date that Jesus is going to come again, but liberal or Tory governments, populist or socialist, regardless, we're moving further and further away from a culture that truly values moral authority of God in our society. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how fast we're running towards the end. Now, I think we have a lot of good reasons, honestly, to expect that Jesus will return in our lifetime. And we'll be talking about some of those throughout this series. But I know that as we move forward in our lives, as we get closer to the end, that these pressures, these challenges that we face because of our faith, they're going to increase. It's not a question of if, again, but it's a question of when. You're going to have to choose, like Daniel, between compromising your conscience and civil disobedience. Now, there's a really obvious temptation here to just silence God's voice, to stop listening to God for direction in our lives. That's what most of the people in Daniel's day did. But you're also going to be tempted to respond to these pressures in a way that's inappropriate for a real follower of Christ. You might be tempted to respond out of anger or even violence. God said that vengeance is His and His alone. More likely still is that we're going to respond with quiet resentment. We're going to hold on to bitterness in our hearts. And I don't believe for a moment that we can be separated from God's love once God has begun the work on our transformation as we follow Christ. But when we allow disobedience and anger and resentment and bitterness to take root in our lives, well, that crowds out the joy and the peace that's not only our gift as God's followers, but it's a sign and a proof of God's great love. 1 Peter 2:11 is our key verse for this series. And in it, Peter says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." I want you to live this week as a foreigner because your citizenship is in heaven. Depend on God. Live this week as an ambassador because God has given you His peace and His joy, and it is a sign of His love to the whole world.